Hey friends, it's John here, coming to you from my living room, and I'm starting this series that I talked about, My Life in Praise Chapel. Starting in 1984. I was a teenager, 13 years old, just a kid, and from what I understand, not much different from a lot of other kids. Wasn't really a troublemaker. Excuse me, wasn't really a, a popular kid in high school either. Just a kid. Collected comic books, liked rock and roll music, and for all intents and purposes, just your average kid on the block. And I'm prefacing all this for a reason. In 1984, my dad went through a religious conversion, which for all intents and purposes changed his life for the better down the road. Even though my childhood memories of my dad are favorable, by all means. Yeah, there are times he was an asshole, but shoot, who isn't? And if that person never is, then I don't want to hang with that person. But my dad did have some problems with substance abuse. I did not immediately recognize these problems. And maybe I'll admit I was a very naive young person well into my college years. So perhaps I didn't see it. But according to my dad, it was there. His finding Jesus Christ did change his life for the better in many ways. It was just how and where he found his religious faith that makes the story very interesting. Praise Chapel Christian Fellowship, now known as Praise Chapel International, in 1984 had a large number of churches across the United States and overseas as well. Praise Chapel focused on people who today we would say that were addicts in recovery. Jimmy, whom I will refer to by his first name, was our first pastor and the founder of Praise Chapel, Santa Clara, California, in the mid-80s. I still have a lot of admiration for Jimmy. He was one of those rare people that found something awesome in his life and wanted to share it with as many people as possible. And he had this fire inside of him to do that. He had this fire, the drive to get out there and, to go ahead and tell the world about what Jesus Christ did for him. And according to his testimony, which I believe, Jimmy did a lot of drugs and came from a broken home. He told me he never met his father in his life and had, one or two either lived with his grandparents or eventually adopted his last name from, memory escapes me unfortunately, either his grandparents or a stepfather or whatever the case is, but he never knew his real dad. By the time Jimmy was in his teens, he was already using hard drugs. And when I say hard drugs, I mean opiates by way of a needle. And sometimes his testimony sounded like either bragging or a really bad 80s movie, cautionary tale. But because he was an addict who did find his way to recovery through Jesus Christ, He was able to reach other people in the same boat. He was able to reach other people. Like a lot of people know, especially those of you who are involved in AA, or those who study behavior and addiction, you know, you get a lot more mileage when someone's trying to recover from a substance abuse. They can see as many doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists as they want, but if someone who's been through that, who knows through that, and especially knows the bullshit sometimes that someone's going to try to con people when they're in the throes of addiction and trying to recover, an addict knows all that. An addict can relate. An addict who's in recovery knows how to walk someone through recovery as well. Jimmy was that person to a lot of people. And to his credit, I will say right here, he helped a lot of people through a lot of shit that perhaps AA couldn't do, or their family couldn't do, or any other hospital can do. I saw that Jimmy reached a lot of people. And in a lot of ways, because he reached my dad, I'm eternally grateful. Now, Jimmy's way of pastoring was the model for Praise Chapel. My understanding, Jimmy did not have much of a formal education at all. I don't even know if he had a GED. I doubt if he had a high school diploma. If he did, if he does, he does. But from what he's mentioned and everything, he's very uneducated. And that comes into play later on in what I have to say about this portion of my involvement in Praise Chapel. The congregation was a lot of people who were addicts. And it was a chain of events that led my dad to the church. One man who suffered from severe alcoholism and was one of those people that were just back and forth. He found his way to Praise Chapel, found something great. And from there, he brought his daughters to Praise Chapel. The one daughter that I knew, she had lots of problems with substance abuse and whatnot. She found Jesus, got her life in order. Today she's happily married. She has some great grandkids that she loves to plaster all over Facebook. She's a wonderful person now, happily married. Her kids are very successful. And I could tell you right now, when I met her, she was a single mom who barely had a roof over her head, if she was lucky. And from what I understand, she and her husband still have a good foundation in their faith, which I like to see. Through this particular woman, a friend of hers came to the church as well, and that friend eventually invited my father. My father then, finding a way to reconcile and get through his dependencies and addictions, as well as a lot of his emotions growing up, he brought my family in, my mom and myself. Later on, my sister and brother as well. And my dad got very involved. And he changed. I say that as both a good thing and a bad thing. But he did become a different person. And that's illustrated where he's always mentioned to people that he raised me differently than he raised my brother and sister, who are a number of years older than me. And in retrospect, I can see that. Praise Chapel did a lot of good things for a lot of good people who are going through a lot of shit. And I know people out there could say, "Oh, well, there's plenty of people that get through take care of their demons or whatever without religion." I'm happy for them. But for some people, this works. It's how Praise Chapel pastors and handles their congregation that I had questions with. And that's where things sometimes borderline what we might define as a cult. Extreme cases of cults were, of course, David Koresh, Jim Jones, Heaven's Gate, other organizations that are less known, like the Children of God, or in some cases, things like Amway. Some of those practices Praise Chapel did might meet those definitions, and we're going to talk about that and how it affected me and how I reconciled it. Praise Chapel, for instance, discouraged television, radio, media of any time. And back in the 80s, it was records, tapes, even news broadcasts. Much like a lot of churches today, I'm noticing, they're very careful about telling you how and who to vote for, but highly suggest those things. I remember the day we got rid of our TV. And I remember the night that Jimmy and his wife were at my parents' house, and they took it upon themselves to convince me to collect all of my records and allow them to not just throw them away, break them. With frightening, fervent joy. Because it was considered worldly. And that's a term, on normal circumstances, that word really doesn't have any negative connotations, but I grew up with that word being something very bad. If something was of this world, it will deter you from Jesus and it will send you to hell. It's pretty much what Jimmy told me. I was a naive kid, and my parents, to their credit nowadays, in 1984, they were rather naive too. They were really new to Christianity. And it's pretty much how Praise Chapel operated. Isolating people from the things they know. Isolating people from their family, unless they're followers of Christ as well. And the term follower of Christ had to fit a very serious definition. It wasn't enough to go to Catholic church every week. It wasn't enough to just be part of the local Presbyterian church. Praise Chapel, we met 3 times a week, twice on Sundays and once during the week. And of course there was outreach programs we had, which a lot of people were forcibly encouraged to take part in. And I'll define that, which is basically saying we were never ordered to. We were just told it's what Christians do. And of course, you want to be a good Christian, right? Jesus said, go out and tell the world about me. This is how we're doing it. It doesn't matter if you have school in the morning. It doesn't matter if you got a paper to write. It doesn't matter if you got to work the next day. This is more important. And that's how a lot of people were shamed into participating in a lot of things. However, the other end of that too is it gave a sense of community, of belonging. You belong somewhere. People want you there. And even in 1984, that could have been kind of rare. Nobody put a gun to anyone's head. But a lot of us did participate in that. And the congregation did give a sense of belonging, feeling, and I still remember how it felt. It was a great feeling. A lot of forced conformity. No one held me down and cut my hair, but the constant little comments persuaded me to perhaps look more like the people there. Shorter hair, dress more conservatively. The biggest thing was I was a kid. Kids have problems. And those problems weren't always drugs and alcohol. The worst I ever did, pranks. I had 4 or 5 friends that I lived on Tumbleway with, and I'm friends with a few of them on Facebook. You know, no house was safe. If we wanted to break in your house, we're getting in. And we weren't going to steal your car, or we weren't going to steal anything. We just did it to be little merry pranksters. I mean, it was easy in the 80s. Locks were easy to pick. My goodness, there was no alarm systems nowadays. You know, back then you could have 5 people. Sometimes had 1 or 2 deadbolts on their front door, but their garage door, it was easier to pick than a girl's hope chest. If you don't know what that is, Google it, okay? But that was the most trouble I got into, just being a little merry prankster, pissing off the neighbors, making noise up and down the street. I wasn't a troublemaker. And God, I never used drugs until I was well in my late teens, early 20s. A story we'll get to next time. But you get the idea who I was as a teenager at that time. Most of the congregation Praise Chapel, they were using drugs by the time they were my age. They were escaping reality by that point. So, when it comes to talking to people over there about this being a teenager, peer pressure, girls, homework, papers, what kind of college to go to, nobody in that church could relate to that because they were doing anything they could to escape the reality they were in when they were my age. So the only advice they could give me was the advice of an addict who was 13. And most of it was just discouraging, talking to your friends in high school, talking to this and that. Those aren't your real friends. We're your real friends. I'm like, really? So the biggest problems right there was having nobody to relate to when I was young. There was no, you may think, hey, my church had a youth group. Praise Chapel, at least in Santa Clara, 1984, I heard the pastor over the pulpit tell the people, we don't believe in youth groups. We indoctrinate everybody the same, blah, 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 basically. First off, not a good idea. Second, lots of places had youth groups. Why? Because kids have a different set of problems. Kids have different needs. Which brings me to my other problem with Praise Chapel at that time. Much to Jimmy's credit of helping a lot of people through a lot of shit, his target audience was, of course, addicts and people who were just trying to get their lives in order after their lives went insane. Jimmy was not educated. And that's important. See, Praise Chapel, they had this mentality where they figured, the disciples, they only had 3 years with Jesus, so pretty much, work your ass off in the church and, read the Bible as much as you can and learn as much as you can. In 3 years, you're ready to go and teach other people about Jesus. Well, that's all nice in theory, but Yeah, it's easy for someone to say, yeah, the disciples didn't go to a Bible college, or the disciples didn't go to a university, and, blah, blah, blah. Probably because there was no Bible to have a Bible college back then. And it's a logic that fails. Having somebody start a church that's supposed to help people, but they have no education on how to help people. And I'm sorry, the Bible's not enough. And I will give a perfect example. A man I will call Steve. I liked Steve. He was a nice guy. He was in our church, one of the first people there. And some of you who might be watching this and were involved in Praise Chapel at that time, you remember Steve also. Steve had some demons. And I don't mean the literal demons Praise Chapel always held over our heads. Looking back at Steve, I believe he was bipolar. There were times when he would have very excellent highs and the world was great and he was confident and he can share Jesus with anybody he walked up to, and a lot of people would be receptive. And then there were the crashing lows where he would come in and you could just look at him. He's so depressed. Praise Chapel, and I don't just mean Pastor Jimmy, did not know how to handle, let alone minister to someone like Steve. Observing and looking back at those observations 30 years later, it seemed like Jimmy was like, hey, I'm not depressed. Why are you? This is all your fault, Steve. Snap out of it. Jesus didn't save you to be depressed. Everyone else here is not depressed. Why are you? It's pretty much how Steve was handled. And looking back at that, after my education, it's probably the last thing Steve needed. And unfortunately, for everything Jimmy did for the congregation, he was not equipped to handle the needs of Steve. Sometimes I wonder what happened to Steve. I do hope he's doing fine, and I do hope he got the help he needs. That's one of many examples of how the lack of education that Praise Chapel's ministers had did possibly as much harm than good. I can't stress enough how much I do admire Jimmy for reaching a lot of people. I just can't help but imagine how much more he could have done if he had some education. Knew how to handle the complexities of marriage problems in a biblical sense. Knew how to give advice to young people before they get married. Learn how to handle teenagers who are so impressionable. New Year's Eve 1985 going into 1986. I remember it because it was the year that Ricky Nelson died, if memory serves. And it was also the year of the seatbelt law in California. Because after that service that night, pastor from the San Jose church, we had a regional conference for the New Year's Eve. He had to remind everybody, hey, as of midnight, seatbelt laws were in effect. It was at that particular service that it was announced that Jimmy and his wife would be leaving the Santa Clara church. and starting a new church elsewhere in the United States. A lot of people were sad. A lot of people, for everything that is less than pleasant, I talked about Jimmy. He did help a lot of people through a lot of shit. And he was approachable. And he had a good heart. But a lot of things I had a problem with. Biggest one was that night. Everyone was saying their goodbyes. It will be a few weeks before Jimmy would actually pack up and leave. His replacements were coming in soon to meet us. And of course, amongst all the huggings and shaking hands and getting a few words in, blah, 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 Jimmy came to me, took my hand, shook my hand, gave me a bro hug, and he said, Mark, they called me by my first name back then. Mark, I consider you a man. And I still remember hearing that and being offended. Now, yes, in the biblical times, by the time somebody was, in 1985 New Year's Eve, I was 15. Yeah, in the biblical times, yeah, I would be considered a man. Reproductive parts are working. It's time for you to get married and start squeezing out kids until, you die at 30, Life expectancy sucked back then. Unless you're Methuselah or some shit. But, this was not the biblical times. This is 1985. I was barely trying to figure out who I was in the world. I wasn't ready to be a man. I wasn't ready to have that kind of responsibility. The only job I had was delivering newspapers every morning. All the responsibilities I had was just trying to get my grades and get through school. And it felt like he was robbing me of my teenage years and my childhood by making me think I was a man. That really bothered me because I was confused enough as a kid. I mean, being 13, 14, 15 is confusing enough. Throw in a borderline religious cult, man, you got one kid that's this close to stepping over the edge and being really fucked up. Looking back today, I knew Jimmy meant well, and he was trying to encourage me. I acknowledge that now. I just think it could have been worded better. I just think if Jimmy had an education, he could have done a lot more with people. I mean, I see some drug and alcohol counselors nowadays who, they went through some shit. And they were in recovery, and they went and got their education. They, sometimes got a master's degree in counseling, whatever the case is. And when it comes to aiding people in recovery, those people can almost move mountains. But what's done is done. 1986 saw a different pastor come in. An old tent revival preacher named Jack Neville. And I'm using his name because I got a lot of good things to say about him and very few bad ones. Actually, I can't think of one negative thing to say about that man. And we'll talk about him next time. But this is the preface of my life in Praise Chapel. Up until January 1986. We'll catch up later. Those of you who are watching, I appreciate it. And any comments, let me know. Other than that, y'all have a good night. Thanks for listening. And if you learn something, I'll be even more happy.